Hi, everyone. Today, we'll be talking to Wren about their upcoming graphic novel, The House on Caple Hill. Check out the link in the description to watch the playlist of all of the podcasts we've recorded so far about this graphic novel. Last time, we had compared Jo with Claude, since they are the main characters of the first book of the series, the Book of Khet. So this time, we'll be looking at the two main characters of the second book, the Book of Khet, who are Laurel and Jo. Josofín, that is. So, the first question we have is, what are Laurel's main personality traits?
Laurel's key personality traits are her charisma, her effervescence, her charm, and her poise. She's definitely a person that, in a very continental sort of way, I would compare to a Southern belle in that she's very confident and she has her own opinions, but she's going to express them in a pretty way and convince you that it was your idea.
I see. So she's very extroverted.
Yes, she is very extroverted. She gets along very well with others, and she's a very social personality. She gets her energy from being around people.
While Josephine, as we talked about last time, is an introvert.
Yes, I think Josephine definitely feels most confident when she's alone. um,
hmm
she feels sort of drained by being around other people, and that she has always had um, a certain expectation of how she's supposed to behave around people, and she finds it more of an act than anything else, and it's just draining.
Right. And would you say Laurel is more extroverted or Claude?
I would say Laurel is even more extroverted than Claude, because Claude is kind of a closet introvert. He knows how to get along with people, and he's had to learn how to get along with people because he has a lot at stake, writing on whether he's accepted in society. Whereas Laurel is it's almost a game for her. It's enjoyable, it's fun, it's kind of a it's something that gives her um confidence almost in and of itself.
Right. So she likes making an impression on people.
She does. That is a very good way to describe it. And she does make an impression on people. She's one of those kinds of people that quickly becomes the life of the party or the center of attention. People are drawn to her and attracted to her. And, um, she's good at uh, giving people the impression that every one of them is special to her as
hmm
soon as she meets them. She's a very gracious and elegant kind of person.
Right. And that you've already answered the second question, which is what kind of first impression does Laurel make on people? So, she is very cheerful. It seems like she's very considerate because, everyone who talks to her feels, energized and they feel special when they talk to her. So she has a skill at kind of making people feel comfortable.
She does, almost in a very television host kind of way. She makes people feel comfortable. She makes them feel special and thought about and all of those things. And for her, it's very easy. It's almost a game of finding out what people like.
hmm
And you know, that trait in and of itself can be problematic in the sense that, there are people who are like Laurel, just they're very social, and there are people who are people pleasers, and that's all they're looking for is um, how to make people pleased with them. But that's not Laurel's goal because she doesn't mind if somebody doesn't like her, you know. Um, but she does have a sort of hobby of finding out how to make people, make their lives a little better.
Right. So is she very curious about people?
She's curious about people, but in a different way than Joe is per se, because Joe is curious about people, but she doesn't really want to interact with them necessarily. Whereas Laurel, uh, she immediately wants to interact with them. She wants to talk to them. She wants to know all about them. And eventually, when having grown up in this little tight-knit community in a place where everybody knows everybody, um, Laurel's very casual in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's not
Right.
in any kind of stuffy or formal way.
But Jo is definitely more formal.
Jo is very formal and very serious. She's always serious, whereas Laurel is always trying to make people laugh. She's always, she's very witty. She's always trying to, you know, in a very playful way, get reactions out of people as a way to make them feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm. I see. And what are Jo's main personality traits in the second book? Have they changed since the first time we saw her in the Book of Khet?
So, since the Book of Khet, it would be fair to say that she has gained some confidence in that she doesn't want to be told who to be anymore. And in meeting Laurel, she sees a chance to become a little bit more, she sees a chance to start over quintessentially and not be the same person that she was necessarily. But the approach is a little superficial in a sense because Laurel, you know, in the attempt to encourage Jo to, be someone new, sort of gives her a very movie makeover kind of experience, a very My Fair Lady sort of experience where, oh, you've dressed the part of someone new and young and fresh. Here, give it a try, but it's just another role. It's not who Jo is as an individual. She's not like Laurel, but Laurel does try to sort of form her into her own image.
Right. And how does she feel about that?
She feels frustrated by it, and after a certain point, um, in the most cordial and friendly kind of way, she kind of she has to express to Laurel, "I can't keep up with you," and being a fun, youthful person like you are. But the two are still friends in the sense that they accept each other as who they are. And Laurel finally says, "Oh, that's fine. You don't have to be." And she, they're able to relate to each other in a way that's more based on um, respect than similarity.
Mm-hmm. Right. So is this the kind of acceptance she's always been looking for? Because previously we discussed how Claude doesn't truly accept these parts of her that are different.
Yeah, Claude does, while he might not understand and loves Jo anyway, he does still encourage her to hide those things because they both have to kind of get by, but at least they can face those terrible expectations together instead of each of them by themselves. Um, I would say that, yeah, Laurel does offer Jo a kind of acceptance and a kind of unconditional love that she hasn't gotten before, even from Claude. And while she sees a little bit of Claude in Laurel in the sense that they both try to encourage her to come out of her shell, um, she also feels a sense of relief that she can start to figure out who she really is around Laurel, and Laurel creates a safe space for that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So how does Jo make an impression on people around Laurel in Laurel's world? How do they make of her compared to how people made of her in her own world, which we saw in the first book?
It's kind of an irony that Jo keeps running into the same problem, but in the opposite way, where in her own time, in this very Victorian time that she came from, she's a little too strong-minded, a little too masculine in that sense. Um, she's seen as odd and awkward when she gets to Laurel's time, which is more in the 19 teens, she people see her as odd because she seems stuck in the past, and nobody can quite get it why that is. And she can't completely explain it to them herself. Um, so she's kind of running into being seen as an outsider either way, because she didn't belong in her own time, but she didn't belong in this one either. Um, so there's kind of it's kind of an insult to injury, if you
Mm-hmm.
will, as she starts to try and learn where and when she is.
Right, because I remember reading in the outline that a lot of people thought she was like a granny.
Right, they kept wondering what she was doing in granny clothes, when she arrived, because she was dressed in this very Victorian wedding dress when she first arrived. Um, and even in that, it just keeps coming up that even as Laurel tries to, lend Jo her own costumes and say, here, try something newer, Josephine still manages to choose the stuffiest clothes in Laurel's closet.
Right. What traits does Josephine like the most about Laurel? What traits does she dislike the most?
um, she admires Laurel's confidence and self-assurance, and her taste for the finer things, and the sort of creative expression of that, especially in the way that Laurel styles herself, in the way that she expresses herself. She's very free, she's very liberated, and she's Laurel is definitely supposed to be the epitome of the Gibson girl, which one could almost compare to the Flappers, in the sense that they were bold enough to try something that their mothers and their grandmothers weren't willing to or weren't able to. They changed fashion, they changed politics, the suffragettes movement, and those kinds of things. The Gibson girls were seen as these figures who um, were more emboldened and dominating women. And Laurel is the epitome of that. She is elegant and she is poised, but she has her own ideas and her own opinions, and she will let you know about it, whether you really like it or not.
Mhm.
Um, Laurel, in a sense, teaches Jo how to embrace and try to celebrate her femininity and not see it as an imprisonment. Um, But on the flip side of that, she sometimes finds Laurel lackadaisical in her attitude, like it doesn't really matter. Whereas Claude maybe took things too seriously and it mattered too much. Um, and sometimes she finds that attitude in Laurel dismissive or even shallow.
I see. And does Joe envy Laurel in any way? Does this affect their friendship?
I would say that initially, and at times, Joe does envy Laurel, in the sense that um, Laurel is everything that Joe felt like she was supposed to be or expected to be. That she's elegant and that she's composed and she can play the game of fitting into society, and it's easy for her. Um, and she's everything that Joe had to like just struggle to pretend to be. But at the same time, she it's a kind of an internal conflict for Jo, because she admires Laurel and she loves Laurel, um, almost simultaneously, in spite of and because she's everything that Jo isn't.
Mhm. What activities do Laurel and Joe like to do together?
They probably would most enjoy um, a- engaging in creative pursuits together. Laurel is more of a creative seamstress, or I guess what some would call an aesthete, in the way that she loves to play with clothes. Um, or sometimes painting, and Jo is more of a tinkerer. She's always trying to invent things or make a better way to do things. So she's always fiddling with clockwork and bits. And Laurel is always convincing Jo to not keep things in her imagination, to bring it into reality and not let all those ideas just stay stagnant in her mind.
Right. And did Claude ever do this for her?
Not really. He didn't ever um dissuade her from it or tell her that she couldn't, but more that he um that wasn't necessarily a side of her that he knew how to support, even considering their time and their roles that they were supposed to play. He wouldn't even have known how to encourage that in Jo.
That's true. Sometimes people just don't know how to encourage people. It's not that they are malicious or, trying to be negligent. It's just that they genuinely don't know how to.
Yeah, I think that would definitely be the case because he's been trying so hard to be a certain thing, um, that he doesn't completely know how to relate to her in that sort of sense. His pursuits were not that kind of creative, and it wasn't a time that looked well upon invention.
That's true, right. So how does Laurel perceive invention, even though she's not an inventor?
Oh, she loves it. Every time Jo shows her the newest gadget she's come up with, Laurel is ecstatic, even if it doesn't work. She's just like, "You made it. It's great. It's wonderful and it's different. I love that you can think this up." She's always enthusiastic.
She's very supportive too, even if it's something that she's not personally, passionate about per se.
Exactly. So, it's part of her gift of making people feel special, is recognizing uh, and validating the talents that she sees in others that she wouldn't even necessarily know how to relate to.
Mhm. Does Joe ever do this for Laurel?
Uh, she does, but at the same time, Laurel doesn't really need it. She kind of does it for a lark and yes, to express herself. Um, and people can even talk about Laurel and how she's too eccentric, and she doesn't care. She just doesn't care. um, no, uh, I would say that Jo appreciates it in the same way. It's beautiful, even if she doesn't understand, or can't conceptualize the kind of beauty that Laurel is interested in creating.
Mhm. So what traits does Laurel like the most about Joe? What traits does she dislike the most about her?
Laurel enjoys Jo's ingenuity. She loves that tinkering mind, and she admires it in a similar way as um, Jo admires her. And this was another parallel I was going to have, is that Laurel would be a little bit of a magic worker, but almost in a, "Oh, I'll do it for a friend. No, 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 don't pay me" kind of way. Um, but she's able to do these things, and Jo is unable to work magic, even in this alternate universe where magic exists. It's still out of Jo's reach, and she admires that talent and that spark in Laurel just as much as Laurel enjoys Jo's invention. Um, and she even appreciates that Jo is so considerate and thoughtful, that she thinks so deeply about everything. But on the opposite side of that coin, sometimes she finds that Jo is just too serious. She just broods constantly, um, and she wishes that Jo could just loosen up a little and have some fun. And sometimes she goes too far with that, yes, but eventually she learns how to take that in smaller steps with Joe.
Right, I see. So about magic, so in Josephine's home world, there was a little bit of magic too, right?
There was a little bit, but it had more become something of like folk traditions. Like the hanging of a horseshoe above a door as a parallel in our world. Like, are those traditions that we still have? Yes. Do we necessarily know that they have a magical context, or do we believe that it works? Not necessarily. So it was a little more extreme in her case just because she was in a different time than ours, um, where they were a little bit closer to their pagan roots and not quite as far away. Um, but yeah, in Joe's world, they sort of um, mimicked the uh, it was like a ceremonial thing, whereas in Laurel's world it is very literal. It
Mm,
it has a very tactile manifestation. Um it's not just symbolic.
I see. So in Joe's world, did anyone manage to master magic at all?
No one had part of the part of the reason that the Caples were there at all was because they had hop timelines from a different universe that had magic, and that was why they believed they were safe. Was they got to Joe's world and there was no magic there, so they presumed they um that they would be safe. um but even they had not mastered magic per se. They were using a form that was the best that they could put together with the resources that they had.
Right. And will we ever find out more about the Caple's original timeline?
Yes, we will be finding about the Caples and their history and the reason they were on the run in the first place at another point later on in the series, um, in the sense that Jo will in her own way see to it that she ties up those loose ends, and for her to do that means to go into their past and find out the root of the cause in a certain way.
Right. And she's going to do that through the time machine, which she builds in the Book of Ka, right?
Well, this would be her first um that would be her first attempt. But much later on in the series, after she has reclaimed all her pieces, she and even as her goals change as far as getting back to Claude, she realizes that the truest way to save them is to find out why they were in that situation that spurred the beginning of her own journey, uh, when it started at the nearer the end of the Book of Khet.
I see. So that's the last book?
That's going to be a big part of the last book, yes.
I see. I see. So, last question. How does Laurel get along with her family, and how does this compare to how Josephine gets along with her family?
So much in the way that Josephine and Laurel are opposites, yet sort of mirrors of each other, I also wanted to construct their families to mirror each other in opposition. Um, and Laurel's parents dote on her. Her family adores her. Her oldest brother is particularly protective of his sister, and the youngest sister, because she has two more in between, who, even in their own begrudging way, they understand that she's the favorite. She's everyone's favorite, and that's just the way it is.
Hmm.
Um, they're a very warm and close family, Laurel's family. Um, and but there is a sense that there is a skeleton in the closet, and they have done a lot of work to keep Laurel innocent of her own history. Um, and it's completely the opposite of how Josephine's family feels. Her family feels very cold and detached. Her parents very clearly see her as a disappointment because she just can't live up to the expectations that their society has. Um, Joe's brothers, her two middle brothers, sort of understand her because they understand her masculinity. But they are also put in a position where they are told not to encourage it after a certain point. Um, and their family is so overbearing that they don't stand up for Joe. And Joe's oldest sister is very definitely disillusioned and resentful because she has had to go through the hardship of, um, being a Victorian woman and having to live up to the expectations that Joe just can't seem to, and is very frustrating for her in the sense that she's basically had to say, well, I've had to learn to live in this certain way, and you should have to learn to do it too. You can do it if I did it. And it's she's very embittered.
Right. So it is definitely the complete opposite. And I think by interacting with Laurel's family, do you think Josephine learns a lot because she never had those experiences living with her own family?
Yeah, I would say that it is a huge learning experience for Josephine because um she has never felt protected by her family. She's never felt like they were people who would, again, stand up for her in any way, whether it was socially or even within their own family unit. Um, they were never going to be on her side. Whereas Laurel can absolutely depend on her family in every way. There's, they're so warm and they are so caring and so close, and that starts out as being very foreign for Joe. Um, but as she starts to understand that that's what it should be like, she um, it gives her inspiration to look at who she is and how she interacts with people, because she would rather that others felt the way around her that she feels around Laurel and her family.
That makes a lot of sense. So this really is a lot of character development already for her.
It is, and it's only the beginning, and even Laurel sees that by the end of the Book of Khet. The Book of Ka. Even Laurel sees that there is so much more potential in Joe, and she's only just started.
Right.
And Laurel recognizes herself as only the first step.
Hmm. How many more other steps are there until the last book, right?
Until the last book, yes, Joe will be gaining and, in a sense, losing um, parts of herself as she reclaims the truest parts and leaves behind the things that she learned in order to survive or learned in order to pass in whatever capacity. Um, so there, she has a long way to go, and she doesn't even know what all of those steps are or entail, and that's just part of the adventure.
Right. So for the Book of Ka, which parts do you think she left behind?
Mm. I would say that she leaves behind that initially she will have lost trust, but I would say that she leaves behind her need not to depend on people, um, and her need to fill a role. Uh, and even as much as it takes time and it takes experience and it takes um, some difficult experiences and conversations, Joe, by the end of the Book of Ka, is ready to be authentic. She just doesn't know how yet. But she gains that desire for authenticity.
Right. And this leads us to a potential next podcast episode, which is another character comparison. I think we were talking about potentially doing a character comparison between one of the most negative characters in the Book of Ka with Claude, right?
Yes, I suppose technically he'll be moving backward to the Book of Khet, um, but yes, the Earl King's family, his grandson specifically, who goes by the name Peter, is who we would be comparing to Claude, and they both take the role in their own portions of the story as Josophine's spouse. So we sort of get to see a contrast between the two as one who is, Claude is benevolent but not completely sympathetic in the sense that he doesn't understand how to relate to Joe all the way, whereas Peter is actually malicious um, and doesn't want to understand at all.
Right. And would you say he's the antagonist of this book?
Oh, um, I think you could. Well, he's one of them, I suppose, because I would say that I would say he's the most obvious antagonist. Although I would say that the matron Monteron who sends Josephine into a world not her own and a time not her own could also be seen as the antagonist. But we don't really understand all of the uh, implications of that. So, yeah, I think it would be fair to say that Peter is the antagonist.
Right. And his story does get resolved in the Book of Ka, right? Or does he come back later on?
His story is resolved in the Book of Ka, yes. After Jo builds her time machine and finds him in his own time before he knew her, she is able to resolve his story in a positive way.
Right. So next time we'll be learning more about Peter and how he compares to Claude.
Yes, I think it'll make for a very interesting discussion.
It will be, especially since they never interact, right?
Yeah, that's true. They never interact. They exist on different planes, and they never cross paths. So their only link is Joe, really.
Right, exactly. So we'll learn more about that next time.
Yeah, it's
All
gonna be
right,
great.
see you.